Today's reading is John 2, 7 to 11, so pretty short, pretty sweet. Beloved, I am writing you no new commandment, but an old commandment that you have had from the beginning. The old commandment is the word that you have heard. Yet I am writing you a new commandment that is true in him and in you, because the darkness is passing away and the true light is already shining. Whenever I say, I am in the light, while hating a brother or sister, is still in darkness. Whoever loves a brother or sister abides in the light, and in such a person there is no cause for stumbling. But whoever hates a brother or sister is in the darkness, walks in the darkness, and does not know the way to go, because the darkness has brought on blindness.
I too am short and sweet, so don't want to brag. We are at number 14 in our series here, 15 texts from the Bible, and next week we're going to take a break from it because the district superintendent, Nancy, will actually be giving the message. And so, I want to encourage you guys for our what is it, christening, chartering day. But if you can show up for that, that'd be great. I'm going to be here and learning what that's all about. Yeah, we'll be wearing white dresses, yes. The book of, boy, I'm off to a good start, aren't I? Yeah.
It only gets better from here.
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. 1 John, actually, this is one that it took me a little bit to decide exactly which pieces to pull out of this letter. I'm a fan of the letter. It's a short letter, and it's one that I've always enjoyed reading. I want to give you just a little bit of history on the letter of 1 John. We are in the late 1st century around this time. That's what's guessed. The authorship of this is questioned sometimes. Some people think that it was John that wrote the Gospel of John, the disciple of Jesus. Others think that it might have been just a disciple named John. The one thing that I can say is that the style in which both of those are written, 1 John and the Gospel of John, are similar. And so a lot of people think that because of the similarities, they might have been written by the same person. Now, they're written in a way that's just like the Gospel of John. Sometimes there's like some fancy words. Sometimes there's a little bit of instead of just going to point A to point B, there's a little dance in between there, and sometimes it sounds like a sermon, sometimes it sounds like a song, those kind of things. That's how they know that, or feel that a lot of people feel that they were written by the same person. He's addressing house churches in what we believe is Ephesus. And Ephesus was the house churches where people would meet in these homes. It's really kind of similar to where you're at right now. It might be a little bit less populated than what we're at right now, but there were several of these homes that were having this. And what was happening is that there was starting to be some division. Believe it or not, there was division within churches. I know, it's shocking. Yeah, try to get a hold of yourself. And this is what he's actually referring to when he mentions the Antichrist. A lot of times we think that the Antichrist, we think about the Revelation and things like that. For him, he's really talking about this group of people that are just anti-Christian. Right there is where Ephesus, the ancient city of Ephesus, was. Here's Greece over here. There's Italy. We're in Turkey, basically. And this is some ruins of it right now. And so this is kind of gives you a hint of what the place was like. Now, to set the scene a little bit for you, these home churches were starting, and just like the church that we are, we believed in the resurrection of Christ as the foundation, really, of what Christianity is all about. But what's happening right now is there is an offshoot of people trying to kind of start their own thing. Rather than following Jesus, what they want is, in a sense, Jesus to follow them. It's more about some of the power and things like that. And they're getting to a point where they're even kind of drawing away from the resurrection and things like that. Now, there were other factions in this time. There were people known as like Gnostics and things like that that kind of took the basis of Christianity, but they morphed it and they kind of just it was no longer Christianity when what they were doing. It was more really about themselves. And so John's very concerned because He doesn't want the church to get confused here. You still have, just like in the church of the early first century, you still have Israelites and you have pagans, and they've joined together and they're starting this church. Now, some of these folks that are splitting off are going into some of the pagan style of stuff, which is what the early church founders, people like Paul and stuff, where they were adamant about pulling people back to the center of Christ and not getting caught up into the old ways of Jerusalem or the old ways of paganism. And so it was really important for Paul to keep that peace there. But this is where the confusing part, where he starts. He starts out with, Beloved, I am writing you no new commandment, but an old commandment that you have had from the beginning. The old commandment is the word that you have heard. Okay, so he starts out in this vein there. And so if you were an Israelite in that church, immediately you would go to the Ten Commandments. That was what, when someone mentions the old commandments, all that kind of stuff. Now, this is the Ten Commandments. There'll be a test after this. And so just don't forget any of them. And they didn't forget any of them either. They just didn't live by the law anymore. So it's very hard to say, this is the stuff that they would still follow, but to them it wasn't about living by the law. We hear a big push to post these in schools and things like that. I can tell you a good guess that the early church founders, this is not the choice of what they would choose to post in the schools, because they did not live by the Torah anymore. They didn't live by this. It went deeper than this. It was much more important than just this. Now, they agreed with this. They weren't out there, killing everybody and all that kind of stuff. They were honoring people, but they were honoring not because it was a law, but because of a bigger reason. And that was what was so important to them. But that's what's happening in this first century. There's people that are pulling away from all of this stuff to where they're morphing. They're still calling themselves a church, but they're saying that they don't have to abide by some of this stuff. Now, John goes into a little bit more detail a little bit later on in his letter. He says, do not love the world or the things in the world. The love of the Father is not in those that love the world. For all that is in the world, the desire of flesh, desire of the eyes, the pride in riches, that comes not from the Father, but from the world. Okay, now John is not, I keep saying Paul, early letters. John's not telling them to hate the world. Sometimes we have actually people that have read stuff like this and they think that as Christians we're supposed to just stand away from everything and shun everybody that walks and talks and breathes. That's not what John is saying. John knows that there's beauty in the world. He knows that there's great things in this world. But what he's trying to tell them is don't forget who made it. Don't forget the first thing that you worship. Because they're in a place, when you're surrounded by the pagans and all of this kind of stuff, there were people that when it talks about desires of the flesh, the eyes, all that stuff, for them this was worship. They would worship stuff. They would idolize things. There were things, there were Greek gods that they worshipped, and the act of worship was very lustful. And this is kind of what's happening. The church is splitting. They're becoming a little bit more. They want to play in this playground. And John's trying to say, this isn't Jesus. This isn't what this is about. If we break it down, let's just break down like desire of the flesh here. Of course, we're talking about like promiscuity. We're talking about cheating on each other. We're talking about infidelity, all of that kind of stuff. We're also talking about transgressions. Not respecting a person's personal space. We're talking about abuse. We're talking about, actual, abuse. We also talk about addictions. We get into the things that please us, make us feel good, and that can lead to a wide variety of addictions, whether it's drugs, alcohol, gambling, sex, whatever the case may be. It can lead to all of that stuff. And eventually what happens with that is it leads us into a place of low self-worth, because what we are doing is we are starting to define ourselves by this. We get so caught up into this that we start to define our self-worth that way. And soon, just like any addiction or anything like that, you cannot keep up the pace enough. You cannot keep it going enough to satisfy the way that you feel, and you start to feel very low about yourself, okay? So anyway, that's what Rod said to me, and so when he, oh, hi, how about that? Find a seat, Chowderhead. I'm in the middle of this. Okay, now. Yeah, probably. I don't know. I fell asleep most of the way through it. So this is where it leads us, and John is saying, there are things that do make us feel good, and there are things that give us pleasure, but never forget who created all of that. He goes on with the desire of the eyes. Now, that gives us shallowness. We judge people by just what we see. We don't go further than that. We take people just at face value in a derogatory sense because we become judgmental. We see someone that's different than us or looks different than us, we form a judgment. They say that it only takes 6 seconds for our brain to make a judgment about somebody. And many times that can be dependent on where we are in our lives. And if we are living in a world where we are only focused on what we see, sometimes our first impression of somebody can be quite negative. We get greedy because the things that we see, we want. And again, this leads us to a low self-esteem, a low insecurity in our lives because we can never keep up with it. All of these are so shallow that to live our life to where we define ourselves by these kind of things, by how much stuff we can have or how we look or how other people look, we can't keep that dance going very long. We're like spinning plates on the sticks. We just can't keep it going. And eventually those are going to fall. And John is seeing this, but in this first church, when he's seeing this, the actions of the people that are breaking off of this, they're starting to go in the ways where they start to value things rather than valuing God. And he sees how shallow that is. He knows that the early church, if we were to go this way, it's on fragile ground. It's not going to last. There's got to be something more sustainable to it because this kind of stuff leads us to a place where we start to not go deeper, even with ourselves. How many times have you looked at a magazine or magazines used to be on paper. They'd open them up and things like that. But you see on television or something like that, you see an image of somebody and you immediately compare yourself to that image. You look at yourself in the mirror and you hate what you see because you haven't been photoshopped, but the other person has. But you base your self-worth, your self-esteem, you base the measurement of a person by that, and it doesn't last. It does not last. Same with the pride and riches. Now, the riches can be whatever gives you the pride. It's not just monetary. It can be like a lust for power. It can be the trying to be better than somebody else, the pounding of the chest. It can lead to self-centeredness, where we are constantly thinking about ourselves. We become apathetic because we stop thinking more about other people. People will, in the quest for power and strength, they will step over their neighbor in order to get it. They will walk on somebody in order to get it, and they will villainize people in order to get it. We see that in our politics right now. We see that going on in our news cycle right now, where people are being almost demonized so someone else can feel powerful. And what that usually leads to, eventually, again, it's a plate spinning and it will drop. We start to get paranoid. We start to think that we have this thing called false pride. We start to think of everybody as a threat to our power. Or if they say something, are they looking, a little bit too close? Am I losing that power? Is that person better than me? All of those kind of stuff. Now, every one of these things that I'm mentioning here are the things that John warned us about at the end of the first century in those first churches because he saw people starting to pull toward this. We're still doing it. We're still doing all of this stuff. There's a Greek god, Aphrodite, I think is what the name is, and she was basically the god of sex. And there's a theologian that I follow that says that we are worshiping her stronger today than we ever have. Because every show, every song, everything that we look at has to do with that. And he said that's where we're getting our self-esteem, that's where we're getting our self-worth, that's where we're getting that. And in fact, we are turning to where we are worshiping that. We're still in the divided church here. We still have a prideful element where my view is right, your view is wrong. The way that I live my life is right, the way that you live your life is wrong. We're still infighting in those churches. We are still at a battle. The warnings that they gave in the first century are warnings to us still today. But thank God, truly thank God that he wrote this letter, because there was a small group in these home churches that got it. And they weren't going to play the game. They knew that there was something deeper than all of this kind of stuff. The pagans had lived their life with lustful ways and all this kind of stuff as ways of worship, and they knew that it never got them anywhere. That's why the whole revolution of Christ resurrected was phenomenal to them, and they felt different. The Jewish people that were slaves to the law, that lived by that, understood now why they lived the life that they lived. It was deeper than that. They stayed deeper than that. They knew that there was beauty in the world. They knew that there was things that make them feel good in the world. They knew that it didn't define them. What defined them was Christ. And the church that was breaking off to that is still around. We're still in places where we get to get caught up into that stuff. We can still, I don't know about you, but I don't know if I can go a week without comparing or looking at something, or maybe getting a little bit drawn. You know, the shiny things in our world. I see a Jeep Wrangler drive by, I start to foam at the mouth. I don't know why, it's an ugly thing, but I love those things. And I think, wouldn't my life be better if I had that? The truth is, it wouldn't. I'm bald. I burn. If I had a Jeep and really enjoyed it, my head would not. But I have this fantasy that this is what would define me, you know? When we get centered of who Christ truly is and stay focused on that, we know that there's things that would be neat if we had, or ways that we could look, but we know that that's what our faith is much deeper than that. He said this, right after the old commandment, he said, "Yet I am writing you a new commandment that is true in him, Christ, and in you, because the darkness is passing away, and the true light is already shining." What he's saying there is that Christ being resurrected, Christ defeated evil in this world, Christ defeated death in this world. That is what our focus should be on. That is where we get our strength, is on that. When we start to worship the other things, when we start to idolize the other things, it pulls us away from that prime meaning. And the church in that day, the people that were breaking off, were starting to look at the resurrection of Christ as either secondary or not even in existence. It was more about them. It was more about using the Christian motive and the movement to give them power, to be more about them. They wanted Jesus to work for them, but this church knew that they were saved by Christ, that Christ was there for them. They stayed true to that. And that's the light. The darkness is something we can get really poorly caught up in. What he's referring to is the Gospel of John when he says new commandment. And this is one of the things that Jesus said, one of the last things he said to his disciples in the Gospel of John. "I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another." Now see, this is the thing that we start to think is secondary in our lives. We start to think of the act of love as something that's secondary, but it is primary. Just as the early people that were offshooting started to use lust and greed and power and things like that as their worship, as signs of their worship, this church, the true church, their act of worship was love. You could define it in the songs, the sermons, whatever the case may be, but truly their act of worshiping Christ and acknowledging Christ was that of love. They knew it, that was the thing that they focused on. And you can have that no matter what you look like, no matter where you live, no matter what things you have, and no matter how much power you think you have. This is the thing that we have. Now, you go to some churches today, and they're going to tell you that your faith is defined by what you have. They're going to tell you that the more faith that you have, the more stuff you'll get. You're going to have pastors that come out with gold rings and all of this kind of stuff. This is a Timex, by the way. It's very cheap. Just so you know, I don't want anything to be, but they brag about the things that they have because they think that that is the definition. They're still going to those pagan ways of lust and greed and all of that kind of stuff. This church, the true church, knew that those were neat. That's great, you know. Oh, you got to watch. Oh, big guy. Well, you can tell time. But they knew that Christ was who they followed. And the act of Christ was love. We still fight over that today. We still fight over love. We think of love as the things that we hear in the songs. We think of love as the person that you got on the date with and all that kind of stuff. The loving your neighbor part is still a hiccup for us, even in the church, because we spend a lot of time, just like they did in the first century, fighting one another. The battles that we have within the church are still happening, and they're the same battles that they had over 2,000 years ago. Isn't that sad? When the key, he put the little key in there for the letter to send it off to us and said, don't forget. It's this. Everything that you heard about, everything that you heard about Jesus, all that stuff, it's this. Never forget that. The more that you focus on that, the more you are the church. If you err on the side of anything, err on the side of loving people too much. Because if you try to mix in hate or competition, things like that, criticism, judgmentalism, you're pulling yourself away. The light is starting to dim. John says, whoever says, I am in the light while hating a brother or sister is still in the darkness. Still in the darkness. Whoever loves a brother or sister abides in the light, and in such a person there is no cause for stumbling. But whoever hates a brother or sister is in the darkness, walks in the darkness, and does not know the way to go, because the darkness has brought on blindness. Now, this is the place that I find that we are in so much in today's world. We have a lot of people that are choosing to hate people. They're choosing to follow people that tell them to hate people. We are really still steering toward the person with the shiniest things, or looks like they have the most power, or the one that gives us permission to dislike our neighbor. And we are still going toward that. There's a thing where, you know, we're going to have this thing called Christian nationalism and thing, but in rough, Christian nationalism is when you take the message of Christ and you use it to be able to give yourself power or to hate a neighbor. That's what it really is. And it's not Christianity. It's what they were doing over 2,000 years ago that John felt so compelled to write the letter and to warn people that they were being led astray. And the worst part is once you give in to some of those things, once you start to give into the lust for the eyes or physical or anything like that, again, I'm not saying that any of this stuff is evil. It's just not what we worship. When you get to a place where you're worshiping it, it gets you lost. It pulls you away. You start to think about the stuff rather than the creator of the stuff. And the more you get drawn to that, the more you get lost. The more you start to search for something to give your life meaning. And sometimes that's drugs, sometimes that's bad relationships, sometimes that's, a quick fix, sometimes that's things that you think in a short-term game you're going to get something, but in the long term you're going to feel miserable. It's those people that are walking around lost. And sadly, we have churches, we have politicians and churches that take advantage of people when they're in that spot. They try to invoke the fear a little bit more. Oh yeah, you should be afraid because you're ugly. You're not as good looking as this person. You're not as powerful as this person. You're poor. Whatever the case may be, you should be afraid. But follow us and we'll make it better. Follow us and we'll make it better. And the way that we're going to make it better is we're going to tell you that person's the enemy. That whole group of people over there, that's the enemy. You make a devil out of them, and you are part of our church. John should have been writing this letter numerous times, and he should have been sending it to churches over and over again with the instruction that every one of us, whenever we started a church, should be reading this as a warning and an invitation. A warning to not give in to things like this. If you are in a church thinking that you're going to be powerful or successful or better than or any of that stuff, you're being led in the dark. But if you're here to experience love, you're experiencing Christ. And what does that love mean? Does it mean I ask my wife to dance? Because that's what all the movies are. You fall in love, there's always a dance. Stupid. Dancing's dumb. I'm sorry, dancing's dumb. I know people disagree with me, but watch any era. You go from the 50s, watch anybody dancing in the 60s today, you'll say, that was dumb. Love is beyond that. Love is going over to somebody that you do not know and sharing Christ with them. Love is about respect. It's about dignity. It's about kindness. We talk about kindness as if it's just this tiny thing. It is the entire thing. It's about standing up for people that are being persecuted against just because of who they are. It's about truly sharing the love of Christ with the rest of the world. It's truly about loving God, loving ourselves, and loving our neighbor. If we want to be the church, we have to read the letter that he sent to the first Christians, and we have to read it as if we're reading it the first time. Do we exercise and celebrate love here? Do you take that love wherever you go? Because if you do, welcome to the light. Would you pray with me? Gracious and loving God, we can stumble, we can fall, we can get caught up into things and stuff. Help us to remember that you are what everything is about. Help us to remember the resurrection. Help us to remember that you defeated death, defeated evil. If we can start our day knowing that, maybe we'll have a little bit more of a positive attitude. Maybe we'll be willing to share that more with others in the way that we treat our neighbor. Help us to continue to stay in the light, to love you, to love ourselves, and to love our neighbor. In Jesus' name, Lord, we pray. Amen.